Story 1. The Patient in Intake. The third wristband printed while I was holding the voided second one in my hand. I remember that detail because it gave me a simple explanation to cling to for a few seconds. I told myself the printer queue had frozen. I told myself the admission server was replaying an old command. Then I looked at the timestamp on the strip. It listed an arrival time that had not happened yet, a bed assignment no nurse had approved, and a witness signature under my own name. Beyond the intake glass, sleet was striking the window so hard it blurred the parking lot lamps into white smears inside. Every chart on my screen closed at once except his. I worked psychiatric intake at the state facility outside Bangor, Maine. It was a sprawling, low concrete campus that looked less like a hospital than an old municipal building that had been taught how to hold people. The adult admissions desk sat between the secured vestibule and the assessment corridor, with a plexiglass window facing the waiting side and two computer stations facing inward. On paper, my job title was Psychiatric Intake Specialist. In practice, I turned crisis into procedure. That meant verifying legal hold paperwork, collecting medication bottles, documenting scars and tattoos for identification, printing wristbands, entering allergy information, assigning property lockers, and routing new arrivals to the correct unit. On a normal night, the work was repetitive enough that I could feel the sequence in my hands without thinking. Scan ID, confirm spelling, confirm date of birth, ask about current medications, inventory belongings, print packet, call nurse, log time. Psychiatry depended on observation, but institutions depended on documentation. If a patient could not be explained on paper, then everyone after intake started from a lie. The week this happened, the coast was being hit by successive winter storms. Snow turned to sleet, then freezing rain, then wind that drove salt from the harbor far enough inland that you could smell it even in the employee lot. Staffing was already short because 2 technicians were out with flu, and 3 more could not get in from rural roads. By my 4th consecutive night shift, we were operating on the kind of reduced census that looked manageable on an administrative email and felt catastrophic in the building itself. I relieved the evening specialist a little before 7 p.m. He mentioned that Workstation 2 had been lagging and that the admissions server had frozen twice during supper. Neither problem sounded remarkable. State systems always had one dying component that nobody had budget to replace. I checked the narcotics drawer seal, counted intake packets, opened the electronic health record, and started clearing placeholder charts from the pre-arrival queue. At 9:40 p.m. I saw the first one. The chart listed a male patient named Aaron Vale, 46 years old, no insurance on file, emergency certificate pending, no referring hospital, no law enforcement agency, no family contact, no transport record. The arrival source field was blank, which should not have been possible because our system required at least a temporary origin to create an active admission shell. I assumed someone had opened a chart from the wrong workflow and abandoned it, so I marked it as error and removed it from the live board. 10 minutes later it returned. This time it had more data. Cedar unit, bed 12, suicide precautions every 15 minutes, regular diet, fall risk standard. Nothing dramatic, just enough to suggest a nurse had started the admission assessment. I called Cedar and asked the charge nurse, Melissa Crow, whether she had a new male patient incoming. She said no. Bed 12 was empty and had not even been turned over yet after a discharge. Nobody on her unit had entered that chart. She sounded irritated, which actually comforted me. Irritation was normal. Confusion would have worried me more. I voided the bed request and sent a message to information systems. Then I moved on because real patients were still arriving. At 11:30 p.m., deputies brought in a man from Ellsworth after a roadside psychotic break. At 12:15 a.m., a mother brought in her adult daughter after 5 days of no sleep and escalating paranoia. At 1 a.m., Brewer called to delay a transfer because the transport crew had gone off the shoulder in the sleet. The building hummed the way old psychiatric facilities always hummed at night. Fluorescent lights, forced air, door magnets, distant television noise from day rooms that nobody had bothered to turn down. At 1:48 a.m., the wristband printer on Workstation 2 woke up by itself. There had been no click from my mouse and no barcode scan. The printer simply hissed, fed out a strip, and stopped. I crossed the room and picked it up. Aaron Vale, a medical record number had been assigned. Cedar Unit, Bed 12. Admit time 2:17 a.m. It was not 2:17 a.m. yet. I checked the print queue, empty. I checked the event log. The order had come from my terminal under my credentials. I changed my password immediately and called security to ask whether anyone had entered. Through the vestibule without coming to the desk. They reviewed the camera in real time and told me no one was there. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the intake door alarm chimed. The vestibule was empty. Both reinforced glass doors were closed. The weather outside looked like static, but the arrival board updated. Aaron Vale changed from pending to present. I remember staring at that status change longer than I should have, as if enough attention might force it back. I checked the badge logs for the exterior door. No event. The metal detector had not registered. The security officer on duty physically walked the front loop, the ambulance bay, and the side employee entrance. No one. No wandering patient. No unauthorized visitor. No transfer crew at the wrong building. Still, the chart remained active. Once a chart became active, the system started building outward from it. Pharmacy received a pending medication reconciliation request. Dietary generated a breakfast tray placeholder. Unit census recalculated. That was what frightened me more than the name itself. The institution was not displaying an error. It was accommodating a person. I opened the assessment tabs. Most were blank, but under psychiatric presentation someone had entered 3 short lines. Patient calm, oriented to person, place and date. States he has been here before. Effect appropriate. There was no author name attached. In the consent section, there was a patient signature captured electronically. It was clean and legible, Aaron Vale. Below it, as witness, was my own signature. I had not witnessed any signature. At 3 a.m., Melissa called from Cedar and asked why her census board showed bed 12 occupied. She had sent a technician to verify the room, and he reported the bed was empty, except for a wristband strip lying on the mattress. I still had the strip printed at 1:48 a.m. I had torn it in half and dropped it in confidential disposal. Yet when the technician brought the one from Cedar down in a specimen bag, it matched the active chart perfectly. Same name, same medical record number, same admit time. The plastic was slightly curled as if it had been wrapped around a wrist and cut away. That was the point when I stopped treating it as software instability and started tracing it. Our current record system had only been active for 6 years. Earlier admissions were stored in legacy archives, some scanned, some partially indexed, some preserved only because state audits required retention. I searched the master index for Aaron Vale and initially got no match. Then, after several seconds, a second result appeared from an older archive, one prior admission. Winter of 2021, same facility, same unit. Same bed. I opened the scan. The packet was incomplete. Property inventory blank. Nursing assessment partial. Physician note unsigned. But the demographic sheet listed Aaron Vale with the same date of birth. No emergency contact, and me as the admitting specialist. In 2021, I did not work there. I was employed at a different hospital entirely. I checked the user metadata. The employee identifier attached to the intake signature matched my current badge number. 8844. My badge had been issued in 2023. There was no clerical route that made sense. A wrong patient merge would not create an employment history for me in a building where I had not yet worked. When the overnight administrator came down, I expected skepticism. Instead, she read quietly, asked me to repeat the sequence, and started pulling old census ledgers from record storage while I searched deeper. The old ledgers were thick binders from before the last conversion, hand-entered by month and unit. She found Cedar Unit, Bed 12 in February of 2016. Aaron, Intake Specialist Daniel Harker, me again. I had not even lived in Bangor in 2016. We kept going backward, 2011, 2006, 1998, when the facility had a different name and half the campus was still open. Each cycle placed Aaron Vale in the same bed. Each cycle listed the admitting staff member as me or whatever version of my role existed then. Admitting clerk, access coordinator, intake specialist. My title changed with the years. My name did not. By then, Cedar was reporting additional inconsistencies. Rounding sheets for bed 12 had entries initialed by staff who swore they had not made them. Environmental Services had a room prep note from the afternoon, stating the bed had been prepared for readmission, not for a new admission. Pharmacy had generated a note requesting home medication verification despite the absence of any medication bottles. The system was not merely generating a patient, it was embedding a recurrence. Near 6 a.m., after the worst of the weather had started to thin into cold rain, the day shift intake specialist arrived and asked very casually why I had left a man waiting in the interview room. I turned and saw him through the narrow wired glass in the door. Middle-aged, state scrubs, hands folded on the table, dry hair, dry shoes, no escort. He looked like any cooperative patient waiting for the next step in admission. The administrator went still beside me. I entered the room first because procedure took over before judgment could. I asked him his name. He said Aaron Vale. His voice was ordinary, not theatrical, not strained, not hostile. When I asked how he had gotten into the building, he looked mildly confused. The same way I always do, he said. You check me in when the storm turns. I asked what he meant by always. He regarded me with the calm patience I had seen in chronic patients who thought staff were slow to catch up. You usually remember sooner, he said. This time you kept trying to delete me. Security came, but their arrival only made the scene worse because none of their systems supported his presence. No badge event, no intake search, no vestibule footage. Officially, he was impossible. Practically, he was seated 3 feet away, answering questions, giving consistent demographic information, and recognizing parts of the hospital closed before I worked there. He asked whether Cedar still had the warped quiet room latch. He asked whether administration had finally sealed the old tunnel to the boiler annex. Then he said something I have replayed for months. When a place forgets someone enough times, he said, it starts building the forgetfulness into procedure. I do not remember the rest of the conversation clearly. That is one of the parts that unsettles me most. Remember printing a revised face sheet and seeing my employee start date changed to 2011. I remember opening my profile and finding annual competency forms signed in years I had never worked there. I remember the administrator calling information systems and stopping halfway through her explanation because the records on her screen now showed that I had transferred from an older state unit that had closed before I entered healthcare. They sent me home after shift, citing fatigue and probable stress reaction. At home, I logged into the employee portal and found 16 years of state service credited under my name. Old tax forms existed, archive training certificates existed, my emergency contact field was blank. 2 nights later, I returned because not returning felt like surrendering the only stable version of events I still had. Intake was running as usual. The printer worked. The windows rattled in leftover wind. Kevin, the evening specialist, asked whether I was feeling better and mentioned that Aaron Vale had been discharged that morning after a routine review. He said it the way you mention a familiar patient everyone knows. I asked to see the discharge packet. He frowned and told me I had already signed it at 6:40 a.m. I still work intake. I still print wristbands, reconcile medications, and verify bed assignments under those fluorescent lights. But now, whenever a coastal storm starts scraping sleet across the glass hard enough to blur the parking lot lamps, I leave Cedar Unit, bed 12 unassigned. It keeps the census cleaner. It keeps the printer quiet. And it spares me the dread of watching the hospital decide, once again, that I have always been there to let him in. Story 2. Observation Room 7. By the time I read my own handwriting in the medication record before I had written it, I was already afraid to look at the clock. Observation Room 7 had no windows, just a camera dome, a bolted bed, and one patient who kept speaking about the next hour, as if he had already finished it. When I stepped into the hall to check whether the overhead code announcement he had predicted was coming, the unit doors locked in sequence exactly as he said they would. Then my workstation refreshed. A nursing note appeared under my name, time stamped 41 minutes ahead, instructing me not to let him fall asleep. I was a psychiatric nurse at a private behavioral hospital in Albuquerque, New Mexico. The facility sat on the edge of the city where the lights gave way to long dark stretches of road and flat land. It handled mood disorders, psychosis, detox stabilization, and short-term crisis admissions. But our locked observation unit served the patients who needed more structured monitoring then. a standard adult floor could provide. I had worked graveyard long enough to prefer it. Nights had a stripped-down honesty, fewer administrators, fewer family calls, fewer competing personalities, just vitals, charting, medication passes, rounding, and the low constant work of keeping unstable minds from colliding with themselves. In July of 2025, the overnight census was light, but the acuity was high. One patient had to be redirected every 20 minutes from trying to disassemble the bathroom fixtures. Another believed the air ducts carried messages. The patient in observation room 7 had arrived just before midnight on an emergency transfer from an emergency department on the west side. Severe dissociative symptoms, intermittent mutism, periods of apparent confusion, no confirmed intoxicants, no active violence. His name was Malcolm Reed, 42 years old. No known psychiatric admissions at our facility. He had been placed under continuous observation after telling the emergency physician that the room around him kept repeating in small, administrative ways. That line was buried in the transfer note, half lost among the standard language about disorganization and impaired insight. What mattered to us on arrival was that he was cooperative, medically cleared, and not requiring restraints. Observation room 7 sat at the end of the short hall nearest the nurse's station. It had a heavy inward swinging door, a shatter-resistant window, and a camera feed that displayed on monitor 4 above the desk. We used it for one-to-one observation when standard 15-minute rounding was not enough. That night, because staffing was thin, I split duties with a mental health technician named Paige. I handled medication administration, charting, and reassessment. She maintained visual contact when I had to leave the line of sight. My first interaction with Malcolm felt almost disappointingly ordinary after the way the transfer note read. He sat upright on the edge of the bed in paper scrubs, hands resting on his knees, gaze steady but tired. No dramatic agitation, no pressured speech, no obvious hallucination response. His affect was blunted. He answered orientation questions correctly. Name, place, month, city, reason for transfer. When I asked why he believed he needed observation, he said very calmly, "Because you keep thinking I'm predicting things when I'm only remembering them slightly early." I documented dissociative language and continued the assessment. At 1:15 a.m., during my first medication pass on the hall, he asked whether the patient in room 3 had stopped yelling yet. Room 3 was quiet. I told him no one was yelling. He nodded like I had confirmed something useful. "Give it 12 minutes, he said. Then he'll start hitting the door after the overhead page." I did not respond. Patient said strange things all night, and building a mythology around every statement was how inexperienced nurses exhausted themselves. I completed the pass, crushed one patient's ordered medication into applesauce, refused one contraband request for shoelaces, and returned to the station. At 1:27 a.m., the overhead system announced a staff assist on the other side of the unit. 3 seconds later, the patient in room 3 began hammering the door and yelling for release. Paige noticed me look toward observation 7. "Coincidence," she said. I agreed because that was still the responsible explanation. At 1:40 a.m., Malcolm asked whether I had already rechecked his blood pressure. I told him I had not. He said, "You will after the charting error." There was the charting error. Not yet. I sat at workstation 1, entered my hourly note, and saw that the electronic medication administration record had temporarily duplicated a discontinued as-needed order from the transfer packet. It was minor, the kind of sync issue that corrected after refresh. I cleared it, printed a variant screen for pharmacy, and then went to recheck his blood pressure because the hospital required updated vitals after any documentation discrepancy involving medication. Lists. He watched me wrap the cuff around his arm as though this merely proved a sequence he already knew. The blood pressure was normal, pulse slightly elevated, skin cool but dry. He asked what time I thought it was. I looked at the wall clock over the station and said 1:47 a.m. He smiled faintly. "That one is behind." I checked my workstation clock. 1:53 a.m. The discrepancy irritated me more than it scared me. We had analog clocks, workstation clocks, badge clocks, medcart clocks, and camera timestamps, and they drifted just enough to create constant charting annoyances. I made a note to call maintenance in the morning and reset the wall unit later. At 2:10 a.m., I found the first note written in my own style, but not by me. The nursing progress section refreshed while I was reviewing transfer orders. A new entry appeared under my name, timestamped 2:51 a.m. Patient in observation 7 continued to state future events as if recalling prior sequence, advised staff not to permit sleep due to restarent effect calm. No overt agitation. I had not written it. The wording sounded like me, not just the facts, but the cadence. I used continued to state more often than reported. I used quotation marks sparingly. I capitalized observation room numbers in exactly that way. For several seconds I considered the obvious answer, that I had typed the note while distracted and forgotten. Then I looked again at the timestamp. 2:51 a.m. had not happened yet. I pulled up the audit trail. The note had been entered from workstation 1 under my credentials. That was when the shape of the fear changed. Software errors were frustrating. A note from the future under my name was something else. I told Paige to remain with line of sight and stepped into the medication room to breathe where no patient could watch me do it. The room smelled faintly of blister packs and hand sanitizer. I remember staring at the locked cabinet of scheduled medications and thinking how absurd it was that everything most dangerous in psychiatry required a signature, a count, and a witness, while whatever was happening on my screen required only a timestamp. When I returned to observation 7, Malcolm had not moved. "You found the note," he said. I asked him how he knew that. He looked at the camera dome, then back at me. "Because that is when you start trying to prove the clocks are wrong instead of the order." I asked what order. He said, "The one the night follows." That answer was coherent enough to be unsettling and vague enough to document as disorganized thought. I charted it, this time carefully, and had Paige co-sign that she had seen me enter the note at the present time. Then I checked the camera feed archive. The live feed showed Malcolm seated on the bed. The camera timestamp on monitor 4 read 2:18 a.m. The station computer read 2:24 a.m. My badge clock on the medication cart read 2:19 a.m. At 2:30-something, though by then I no longer trusted the exact minute, other inconsistencies multiplied. Medication administration records showed that I had documented an as-needed dose for a patient I had not yet assessed. The observation chart for room 7 contained 4 visual check initials in Paige's handwriting. For minutes, she insisted she had been standing next to me. One of the technicians called to ask why the seclusion room release time on his screen was listed as an hour after the patient had already been discharged from seclusion. On any other shift, I would have blamed the server and called the overnight house supervisor. That night, every discrepancy bent around the same room. I finally did call the supervisor, a woman named Dana Ortiz, and gave her the most conservative version I could. Timestamp irregularities, observation documentation conflict, one patient making unsettlingly accurate predictions. She came up from the adult unit and stood beside me at the station, practical and unsentimental, the kind of nurse who had seen enough to distrust both panic and certainty. While she was there, Malcolm asked through the door window whether Dana still wore the silver penlight, clipped inside her scrub collar on nights when she expected trouble. Dana froze before she remembered to hide it. She was wearing it exactly there. She entered the room with me for reassessment. Malcolm remained calm, oriented and cooperative, no signs of delirium, no neurological deficits obvious on brief exam. He told Dana that the problem was not that he knew what would happen. The problem was that we kept sieving the documentation first and mistaking it for instruction. Dana asked him what documentation. "The notes she leaves herself," he said, looking at me. "The ones that make her keep me awake." By 3 a.m., I had 3 more notes on the chart that appeared before I wrote them. Each advised some variation of the same thing. Do not let patients sleep. Recheck time source manually. Do not rely on station clock after 3:12 a.m. I printed them because paper still felt real. The printer spat them out warm and ordinary. The timestamps remained ahead of me. At 3:12 a.m., every clock in direct view of the station disagreed by more than 20 minutes. The wall clock said 3:09. My workstation said 3:12. The medication cart said 2:58. The camera timestamp over observation 7 said 3:41. When I checked my phone, which I was not supposed to have on the unit, it read 3:11 and then flickered blank before returning. Paige started crying quietly. Not from terror exactly, but from the strain of having no stable reference point. Dana sent her to the break room and took over line of sight. I stayed at the station and read through the printouts in chronological order. The language sharpened as the timestamps advanced. It did not read like random corruption. It read like a report from a nurse trying to keep another nurse moving toward a necessary point. At 3:20-something, another note appeared. If he falls asleep, sequence restarts at first medication pass. He knows because he remains anchored to prior cycle. This version has reached room before sedation. I stared at the sentence so long Dana had to say my name twice. This version, not the shift, not the patient, me. I went back into observation 7 alone and asked Malcolm to explain without metaphor. He considered that, then spoke with the patience of someone briefing a colleague who had forgotten previous meetings. He said the first cycle had begun with his transfer ended when he accepted the intramuscular sedative ordered if he became unmanageable. After that, the room returned to the first hour, but not cleanly. Administrative traces survived, observation initials, corrected notes, medication timestamps, enough fragments for the next version of events to lean against. He said I had been following those fragments all night without recognizing them, as my own attempts to keep the sequence from repeating. I asked why he remembered. Because I am the fixed point, he said. The room is built around observation. You are built around process. Process resets. That should have sounded ridiculous. Instead, it sounded close enough to the night I was already having that I could not dismiss it. I checked the standing orders. There it was, the as-needed intramuscular medication to be used if he escalated or attempted self-harm. On my active record, it had not been administered. On one of the future printouts, it had. The timestamp was 4:06 a.m. Dana called through the door that room 3 was escalating again. For a moment, I considered stepping away because that was what responsible staffing required. Malcolm said, before I moved, if you leave now, you come back after the injection. I stayed. The next hour felt less like time passing than like existing inside a stack of nearly identical paperwork. Notes kept arriving under my name. Some contradicted each other in small ways, like they came from attempts that had diverged and collapsed. One said Dana never returned from room 3. Another said the overhead page for physician response would happen even though no physician was in house. Another said I would try to prove the reset with the camera archive and lose 12 minutes doing it. I tried anyway. I lost them. The archive between 3:54 and 4:06 was blank. At 4 a.m., Malcolm's breathing changed. Not distress, not panic, fatigue. He had been awake for most of the previous day before transfer. His eyelids lowered. I understood suddenly that every note warning me not to let him sleep had not been about comfort or policy. It was about threshold. I spoke to him, asked orientation questions, turned on the overhead light, checked pupillary response, did everything short of restraint. He kept answering, slower each time. Then he looked at me with something that was almost sympathy. You always make it this far, he said. That is why the notes keep sounding more like you. At 4:06 a.m., the chart populated an intramuscular administration entry under my credentials. I had not given it. Dana opened the door and asked whether I had called for assistance, because the system had pushed a medication alert to her screen. I turned to answer her. When I looked back, Malcolm's eyes were closed. The room did not go dark. Nothing dramatic happened. The fluorescent lights stayed on. The camera remained fixed, but the station monitors refreshed all at once, and the shift rearranged itself around me. My hourly notes were gone. The wall clock now read 1:14 a.m. The patient in room 3 was still quiet. Paige was handing me the first medication cup of the cycle and asking whether I wanted her to start line of sight in observation 7. I knew what she was going to ask before she asked it because I had just heard it, and because a progress note was already open on my screen under my name, unfinished, waiting for a timestamp that had not happened yet. I do not know how many versions of that night occurred. I only know the one I remember most clearly is the one in which I began printing my future. Notes as soon as they appeared, and leaving them in the chart rack in the order I found them. By morning, when day shift arrived, the clocks had synchronized again. Malcolm Reed had been transferred out after a quiet night, according to the record. There was no intramuscular medication documented, no variance report, no server ticket. Dana told me I looked exhausted and suggested I take a few days off. I did when I returned. Observation room 7 was occupied by a different patient, and the camera timestamp drift had been blamed on a firmware issue. My printed notes were missing from my locker, but one page remained tucked into the back pocket of my medication guide, folded twice. It was in my handwriting. "Do not trust the calm part," it said. The calm part means the shift has already happened once. I still work graveyard. I still verify medication times against more than one clock. And whenever a patient on observation tells me they are not predicting the next hour, only remembering it early, I keep them awake until sunrise, even when the chart says I already made a different choice. Story 3. The group nobody led. The strangest part was not when the patients started talking about the counselor none of us employed. It was when I realized I could remember one of his sessions well enough to describe the chairs, the handouts, and the sound of his voice, even though the schedule on my desk proved the meeting had never been assigned. By then, the weekend double shift had stretched the rehabilitation center into that exhausted, airless state where staff forgot meals and patients tracked every inconsistency in our faces. I was standing in group room B, with 12 near-discharge residents waiting for therapy to begin, and half of them were asking why Mr. Bell had not come back to finish the exercise he started yesterday. I was a psychiatric social worker at a long-term behavioral rehabilitation center in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It was not an acute hospital and not exactly a nursing home. We handled patients who no longer needed inpatient crisis containment but could not yet live independently without a structured environment. Many had severe mood disorders, schizoaffective conditions, traumatic brain injuries, or chronic psychotic illnesses complicated by years of unstable housing and interrupted treatment. My role was part discharge planning, part therapy facilitation, part bureaucratic translation. I ran coping skills groups, family meetings, benefits coordination, housing referrals, relapse prevention sessions, and the endless documentation proving that improvement was being measured, supported, and prepared for. Autumn of 2026 had brought an unusual number of weekend staffing gaps. 2 clinicians had left within the same month, one for private practice and one after being assaulted on another unit. That left me covering a weekend double shift across 2 wings, which meant I was leading the morning and afternoon groups myself, reviewing treatment plans, and fielding crisis pages that normally would have been distributed among 3 people. The center sat on the edge of Milwaukee, an industrial corridor where the wind always seemed to pick up grit from somewhere unseen. In late October, the windows rattled with cold and the heating system came on in short metallic groans that made the ceiling sound inhabited. Group Room B was one of the better spaces in the building. Neutral walls, vinyl chairs, a whiteboard, locked cabinet for worksheets, a clock mounted high enough that patients could not tamper with it. Most of the residents in my caseload knew me well. By the time someone was approaching discharge, I usually had months of work with them. I knew who dissociated when discussion got too personal, who became performative in groups, who memorized coping language without actually using it, who watched other residents for cues and repeated them. So when 3 separate patients asked where Mr. Bell was, my first thought was that they were joking collectively to test whether I would break routine. I told them they did not have a counselor by that name. One patient, a former accountant named Owen Leland who rarely joked at all, frowned and said, "He was here yesterday. He did the memory circles." Another patient, Teresa Wynn, nodded immediately. He had the brown folder. He said not to write anything down because written things leave. That phrasing caught my attention, not because it sounded supernatural, but because it sounded therapeutic in a vague, overconfident way I could imagine some underqualified facilitator using. I asked who had documented the group. Several residents answered at once, all with confidence, all describing a tall man in a gray sweater they assumed worked with me. No such employee existed. I checked the unit schedule board in front of them. Saturday morning group, Daniel Mercer. Saturday afternoon coping skills, Daniel Mercer. No bell, no substitute, no floating clinician. When I pressed for details, some patients grew irritated, as if I were denying something obvious. Others looked embarrassed and withdrew. That split was familiar. Group false memories did happen in psychiatric settings, especially when residents spent months together and borrowed fragments of each other's accounts. Usually, though, they were unstable. This was not unstable. It was shared. I completed the session, documented the references, and mentioned the matter to the charge nurse. She laughed and said maybe dietary had started moonlighting as therapists. Her reaction was so normal that I nearly let it go. Then I found the attendance sheet. Every group session required signatures or initials, both for treatment records and for insurance compliance. I kept the weekend sheets in a binder behind the nurse's station. Saturday afternoon sheet showed 11 residents present for guided recall group. Facilitator, R. Bell. The handwriting in the resident column belonged to the patients themselves. I recognized individual letter forms. The facilitator signature at the bottom was neat, compact, and entirely unfamiliar. I asked the unit clerk whether anyone had added a contractor. She checked the staff directory and found no Bell. Human resources had no Bell. Payroll had no Bell. Still, there it was in the binder. A form filed exactly where it belonged, punched into the rings, and initialed by the clerk on duty as reviewed. I told myself it was an old sheet mixed into the current binder. Then I checked the date, Sunday, October 25th, 2026. That morning I called the clerk who had initialed it. She insisted she had never seen the name before. When I handed her the page, she stared at her own initials for a long moment and then said quietly, "I remember sorting this. I just do not remember him." That should have been impossible. Either she had filed the sheet or she had not. Instead, she seemed to remember the action stripped of its source, like a procedural memory with the person removed. The day went on because facilities always demand forward motion even when staff would prefer to stop and investigate. I ran afternoon medication compliance group on the other wing, handled a family call about discharge housing, and spent 20 minutes calming a resident who became convinced the vending machine had taken his reflection. By late afternoon, I had almost convinced myself the Bell issue was a paperwork anomaly amplified by tired patients. Then, during the second evening group, Teresa raised her hand and asked whether we were supposed to continue the exercise where we listed our first forgotten place. The room changed when she said that. Not dramatically, no gasp, no outburst, just a ripple of attention. Half the patients straightened as if reminded of homework. Owen said he had already shared his. Another resident said Mr. Bell told them forgetting and being discharged were administratively related conditions. Someone else laughed nervously and said he knew that sounded stupid, but he remembered it too. I did not remember assigning or hearing any exercise about forgotten places. Yet as they described it, fragments began surfacing in me. Not images exactly, more like procedural impressions. I could almost feel myself standing at the whiteboard while someone else spoke. I could almost hear the squeak of a marker cap, smell stale coffee, sense the radiator clicking beneath the west windows. The details came without a scene to hold them. I ended group early and went to my office. My office was narrow, overfiled, and too warm, with binders stacked under the desk and discharge packets fanned across every flat surface. I reviewed the weekend calendar, the badge access logs for Group Room B, and the treatment team notes. Nothing mentioned Bell, no meeting requests, no staffing updates. But when I opened Sunday's progress notes, 3 patients referenced material, reviewed in group with counselor. One note written by me stated that the patient demonstrated improved insight during guided recall exercise. I had written that sentence. I could see my thought process in it. It was my phrasing, but I had no memory of typing it. At that point, I should have reported the problem upward as a potential systems issue affecting clinical documentation. Instead, I started asking staff quiet questions. Had anyone heard of Bell? Had anyone seen a gray sweater, a brown folder, a contractor badge? Most said no. 2 said the name sounded familiar. One occupational therapist swore she had passed a man in the hall that morning carrying laminated worksheets, then became visibly unsettled when I asked where he was coming from. Group, she said. I think, or treatment planning. I do not know. I just know I moved aside because he looked like he belonged here. Belonging, that was the word I kept hearing in different forms. He looked like he belonged. The page was where it belonged. The memory felt like it belonged. Nothing specific would hold, but everything around it had already made room. By the end of the double shift, I was tired enough that my own judgment felt soft. I slept badly, came back Monday morning and found the problem had spread. The Monday treatment board listed a canceled meeting titled Bell Review. No organizer. No room reservation. 3 staff members asked whether I had updated the materials from that memory protocol. The nursing station whiteboard had Bell handouts, written near the supply requests, and no one would admit to writing it. This was no longer a patient phenomenon. It had entered staff recall. I requested access to archived scheduling logs and the electronic document, History for Group Room B. The center's software was not elegant, but it tracked edits and room reservations well enough to satisfy audits. On paper, Bell still did not exist. No employee profile, no contractor credential, no payroll data. Yet session records kept surfacing. Guided recall, discharge rehearsal, memory consolidation. Different names, same facilitator initial. RB, sometimes the sessions appeared completed, sometimes canceled. Sometimes the room reservation existed without the note, sometimes the note without the reservation. The incoherence would have reassured me if not for the consistency of the same absence. I spoke to my supervisor, Elena Briggs, and expected her to dismiss it. Instead, she listened too carefully. When I mentioned Bell, she went quiet, then asked me whether patients had started describing his groups as comforting or upsetting. I asked why she would phrase it that way. She opened a drawer, took out a yellow legal pad, and slid it toward me. Several names were written down the left margin. Bell was the most recent. Under it were 2 others I did not recognize. "What is this?" I asked. She said she kept a list of names people began to remember before they were ever assigned to anyone real. Staff, volunteers, consultants, always peripheral roles, always with enough procedural residue to feel legitimate. Sometimes the names faded after a week. Sometimes they lingered for months and altered charts. The center had never found an external cause. No intrusion, no prank, no software breach. "It tends to happen more on rehab," she said, "because discharge planning trains everyone to narrate identity. Once memory work starts slipping, the building does the rest." That explanation was not an explanation. It sounded like superstition hardened by institutional fatigue. I asked how long she had known. She said since her predecessor briefed her 6 years earlier. Then she added something that chilled me more than the list itself. "You only notice it when you're one of the people being remembered by it," she said. Later that afternoon, I found a meeting note in my calendar from 3 weeks earlier. Bell Consult, Group Room B. I had accepted the invitation. The timestamp placed me there during a block I knew I had spent at a housing conference downtown. I had receipts, parking validation, and emails proving it, but the calendar entry remained. Attached to it was a document titled Discharge Memory Continuity Worksheet. The file contained a centered heading, 6 discussion prompts, and a footer listing co-facilitators, R. Bell and Daniel Mercer. My mouth went dry reading my own name next to his. Something in me shifted then from curiosity to dread. Until that moment, I had treated Bell as an intrusion into our records. Seeing myself formally placed beside him suggested the reverse. Perhaps he was not entering my work. Perhaps my work had been gradually reorganized to make his presence seem original. I pulled physical charts from records to compare them against the electronic copies. The paper versions were worse. In 2 charts, progress notes existed only as impressions on the next page beneath a missing sheet, the pressure of someone's handwriting preserved though the actual page was gone. By angling the paper against the desk lamp, I could read fragments. Discussed first forgotten place. Residents identified missing intervals without distress. Daniel to reinforce continuity language next session. The last line used my first name the way internal case notes sometimes did when staff wrote for themselves and expected to discard it later. On Tuesday morning, Owen asked to speak privately before breakfast group. He sat across from me in the consult room and said he wanted to know whether being discharged meant they stopped letting you forget the group. I asked who they were. He looked surprised. "The people who need us to remember enough to keep the rooms from changing." There was no psychotic intensity in his voice. He sounded tired, almost practical. He said the residents had been comparing details. Some remembered Bell. Some remembered only me leading those sessions. Some remembered both at once, which was beginning to make ordinary memories feel porous. He asked whether I remembered the line about written things leaving. I told him yes. That was the first time I admitted it out loud. He nodded, relieved rather than frightened. Then you're in it now, he said. The climax, if there was one, came that evening in Group Room B. I had decided to hold a normal coping skills session and avoid any mention of Bell. I wanted to restore routine, document observable reality, and stop feeding whatever collective contamination was occurring. 12 residents sat down. I distributed worksheets from the locked cabinet. When I turned to the whiteboard, there was already writing on it in blue marker, "Welcome back." Below that, in smaller letters, "Begin with the first place you lost." The marker tray held only black and red. Several residents started crying quietly, not out of panic, out of recognition. I do not remember deciding to continue. I only remember hearing my own voice ask the room to ground themselves by naming location, date, and bodily sensation. A standard exercise. Yet while I spoke, another memory rose fully formed, not imagined, remembered. I had stood in that room before, beside a tall man in a gray sweater with a brown folder. He had never introduced himself because none of us asked him to. He had invited patients to describe places missing from their lives, houses they could no longer picture, streets removed by demolition, schools renamed until they no longer felt attached to childhood. He said institutional recovery depended on tolerable forgetting. He said discharge only worked when memory became administrative instead of personal. I remembered disagreeing with him. I remembered returning the next day to find no record of the disagreement. Only a note in my own charting style stating that Bell's intervention had improved group cohesion. The moment everything settled into place was not dramatic, it was bureaucratic. I realized the facility had been preserving him through our documentation, because forgetting him created holes, and the system preferred inserting continuity over admitting absence. Patients remembered a counselor because the records needed one. Staff remembered meetings because treatment plans referenced them. I remembered co-facilitating because my notes had begun leaning around his missing outline until a memory formed to support the language. Inside that room, it became clear that forgetting had stopped being a personal failure. It had become the center's method of maintaining itself. I erased the whiteboard with my bare hand. Blue residue smeared across my palm. When I looked down, there was marker on my fingers and a fresh attendance sheet clipped to the group binder. Facilitator line already filled. Daniel Mercer, no Bell, just me. The residents watched me with the uncomfortable patience usually reserved for staff who were clearly behind the conversation. Owen finally asked, "Are you going to pretend you were not here yesterday?" I said nothing because I did not know whether it was yesterday's version of the session had been led by a missing counselor or by me under a name the building later discarded. Administration investigated in the shallow way institutions investigate things they cannot solve without implicating themselves. Information systems blamed sync irregularities. Clinical leadership recommended staff wellness checks and reduced overtime. Elena told me privately not to keep paper copies because the paper learns slower, but it learns. 3 residents were discharged that month with relapse prevention plans, referencing group material I still cannot locate. I remain at the center. I still run discharge groups. I still ask patients to name where they are, what day it is, and what helped them make it through the week. But I no longer ask them to write down memories they are trying to keep. Too many pages go missing. Too many notes return in my own phrasing with ideas I never intend to teach. And every so often, when I unlock Group Room B on a cold morning and smell marker before I have opened the cabinet, I find chairs already arranged in a circle that is 1 seat larger than the number of people on my caseload. Story 4, the quiet wing. At 1:23 in the morning, the West Corridor camera showed me walking into a locked hallway that had been sealed for 6 months. At the same moment, according to the badge log on my belt, I was standing still at the security desk reviewing access alerts. Both records were live. Both were time-stamped. Both were me. I remember watching the feed as the other version of me paused beneath the dead light outside room 11 and turned his head toward the camera like he knew exactly where I was sitting. Then the map on the monitor shifted. The corridor on screen was no longer attached to the same wing. I was a hospital security officer at a government mental health center in Colombia. South Carolina. The campus served civil commitments, long-term psychiatric care, forensic transfers, and a small high-observation unit for patients who could not be managed safely in county settings. I had not gone into security because I wanted authority. I had done 3 years in county detention intake and learned that I preferred institutions, where de-escalation mattered more than force. At the center, my work was mostly movement control, badge access, perimeter checks, patient transport backup, and the quiet practical duties nobody imagined when they heard the word security. Reuniting a confused visitor with the main lobby, walking a nurse to the far lot after shift, checking a prop door, logging maintenance issues no one else had time to report. The quiet wing was part of the oldest psychiatric section on campus, a little used hall on the north side scheduled for closure after Thanksgiving. Years earlier, it had housed lower acuity long-term residents. By the time I was hired, only 4 rooms remained active there, mostly for overflow placement, and 1 patient whose treatment team refused transfer because she became severely disoriented in unfamiliar spaces. The rest of the wing had been emptied, boxed, and gradually sealed. The official floor maps still showed the full hall, but the live staffing pattern treated half of it like storage. Thanksgiving week ran on a skeleton crew. Fewer administrators, fewer therapists, fewer maintenance staff, and too many departments telling themselves they could get by until Monday. Holiday staffing changed the rhythm of a psychiatric facility. The buildings sounded larger. Meals were quieter. Patients who had no family contact tended to worsen in subtle ways, not necessarily violent, just more watchful, more withdrawn, as if absence had entered the unit with the cold. My midnight shift began with the usual checklist. Exterior gates secure, south lot camera intermittent but functional. Pharmacy door cleared from prior alert, badge printer working. Thanksgiving meal leftovers in the break room attracting every officer on rotation one by one. Around 11 p.m., the charge nurse on North Behavioral asked me to add extra rounds near the quiet wing, because one of her patients, a woman named Lena Harrow, had become fixated on the idea that the hallways changed places after midnight. That was not especially unusual in context. Psychiatric patients often built delusions around architecture because institutions gave them so little else to orient around. Same tile, same lights, same numbered doors, same absence of natural reference points. Lose a sense of time and the building becomes the easiest thing to blame. I made a note to check on her more often and thought nothing of it. My first round through the wing just before midnight was completely normal. Dimmer lights than the active units, heating running a little too hard. 1 maintenance cart parked outside an empty day room. Old bulletin boards stripped to tan paper backing. Lena was awake in room 4, sitting on the bed with a blanket around her shoulders. She asked whether I had checked the maps lately. I said yes. She told me not to trust the wall map after midnight because it keeps whichever hallway was used last. I asked what that meant. She looked toward the nurse's station instead of at me. Sometimes the wing remembers the route better than the room. That was enough to document as disorganized thought and move on. Still, I noticed when I reached the north end of the hall that the evacuation map in the frame near the exit looked slightly wrong. Not wildly wrong. Just enough that the dead corridor branching toward the sealed rooms appeared longer than I remembered. I wrote it off as the sort of thing you notice only after a patient points at it. At 12:40 a.m., camera feed West 12 showed movement in the closed section. The quiet wing had 7 cameras, all older fixed-angle units tied into a digital recorder with enough lag to annoy everyone but not enough to justify replacement. West 12 covered the sealed hallway beyond the temporary fire door, a section no one should have been entering because the badge plate had been disabled during closure prep. The feed showed a figure passing from left to right too fast for detail. I assumed maintenance. Then I checked the access log. No badge event at the fire door. I radioed the nearest officer to hold his position on another unit and walked up. Myself. The hall was empty. The fire door remained shut. The badge plate was dark. When I pressed it with my own credential out of habit, nothing happened. Back at the desk, I reviewed the clip. The figure on camera was in dark uniform, my dark uniform. That can happen with low light and grain. Security footage makes everyone look like the same tall shadow. What bothered me was the gait. the slight outward turn of the left foot from an old ankle sprain. The pause beneath camera angle changes as if checking blind spots. I watched it 4 times before telling myself I was supplying familiarity where none existed. At 1 a.m., Lena pressed the call button and asked the nurse whether the man in my uniform had found the second station yet. There was no second station. I heard the nurse repeat the statement over the intercom, half amused, and felt something unpleasant settle behind my ribs. I went to Lena's room and asked what she meant. She said, "The desk on the other side, the one you sit at when this hall is the main one." I asked whether she had seen anyone. She nodded. "You, but not the tonight one." Her tone was calm, not florid. That made it worse. I returned to the security office and pulled the architectural floor maps from the access control system. The digital map for North Behavioral showed the quiet wing as expected. 1 active hall, 1 sealed extension, nurses' station near center. I cross-checked the printed evacuation plan from the binder under the desk. On the paper version, the station appeared several yards farther north, and the sealed extension looped back toward a second exit I had never seen open. Floor plans changed over decades, of course. Renovations left paperwork scars. Still, the contradiction bothered me enough that I called maintenance to ask whether an older desk had once existed. In the closed section, no answer. Skeleton crew. At 1:23 a.m., the west corridor camera displayed me entering the sealed hallway. The live badge log still showed me at the desk because I was physically at the desk. I know that with the stubborn certainty of memory attached to the body. My hand was on the mouse. My coffee was cooling next to monitor 3. Yet on screen, another version of me moved past the disabled fire door as if it had opened for him. He carried my flashlight on the left side, same as I did. He paused beneath the dead light outside room 11 and turned his face toward the camera. Grain-obscured features, but I did not need them. I recognized the posture of someone who already knew where the camera sat. Then the digital floor map refreshed. The quiet wing elongated on screen. The sealed section became the active hall. The nurse's station shifted north. Rooms renumbered in a sequence that placed Lena's room nowhere I had just visited. I stood so fast my chair rolled backward into the cabinet. For several seconds I could not decide which failure I was responding to. Camera glitch, map error, dissociation. I radioed the other officer and told him to meet me at North Behavioral. He answered from the south perimeter, farther away than I wanted. I should have waited. Instead, I took my flashlight and went back up. The fire door to the sealed section was open. No alarm, no badge light, just open enough for the rubber edge to brush the floor. Beyond it stretched a corridor I recognized and did not recognize at once. Same institutional tile, same cream paint, same fluorescent hum. But the spacing was wrong. The hall seemed too long by several doors, and at the far end I could see a nurse's station with a half-moon counter, where none existed in the closed section I knew. I stepped through because leaving a compromised secure area unsearched would have been a reportable failure even in a normal building. The air changed immediately, not colder, thinner somehow, and dry enough that every breath felt overfiltered. My radio crackled once and went silent. The flashlight beam flattened against the walls without seeming to brighten anything. On the left, room plaques began at 9, though the active wing ended at room 6. On the right, I passed a staff lounge door marked South Pod. South Pod was in another building. I reached the nurse's station and found it staffed by no one. Computer monitors sat dark. A phone handset lay off the cradle yet made no sound. Shift assignment sheets on the counter listed names I partly recognized, not as current employees but as people retired, transferred, or dead. One line stopped me completely. Security Liaison Marcus Weller. That was me. The date at the top of the sheet was Thanksgiving, 2020. I was not employed there in 2020. Footsteps sounded behind me. I turned expecting an intruder and saw, at the far end of the hall, a figure in my uniform moving away at a steady pace, not running, leading. He turned the same outward left foot as he walked. I followed because some primitive part of my judgment had been replaced by the need to know whether I was chasing a person, a recording, or whatever had been appearing on camera. The hall bent left where no bend should have existed. Past that corner, the room numbers restarted at 1. I passed Lena Harrow standing in the doorway of room 4, blanket around her shoulders exactly as before. She looked at me without surprise. "You took the wrong station," she said. I asked her whether I was still in North Behavioral. She considered the question with more seriousness than many staff would have. "You are in the version that keeps the closed parts on," she said. "Do not follow yourself to the end. That is how people get assigned here." Assigned. Not trapped, not lost. Assigned. Institutional language had infected the terror of the place. I backed away and tried my radio again. Static. My badge reader app on the belt unit showed I had last accessed North Behavioral main desk at 1:11 a.m., not 1:11 p.m. The access list below it contained doors that no longer existed. I started walking back the way I had come. The corridor behind me was not the one I had used. The nurse's station was now on my right. The fire door was gone. I have tried since then to explain the next stretch with precision, but spatial confusion resists testimony. I did not run, though I wanted to. Security training teaches you that running in unfamiliar interiors destroys orientation. I forced myself to count doors, note corners, touch walls. 4 doors to the first bend. Left at the framed evacuation map, right at the medication room, but the signs contradicted sequence. The map showed 2 versions of the same wing overlaid, one shaded, one outlined. The medication room label hung beside a linen closet full of boxed restraints dated 3 years in the future. At one point I passed the same dead ficus tree twice, once in a brass planter and once in a plastic one. Then the cameras appeared. Not the visible domes in the ceiling, the screens. Small security monitors mounted above a second station desk farther down, each showing different parts of the wing. On one of them, I saw myself standing at my real desk in the active security office, staring toward monitor 4. On another, I saw the empty sealed corridor I had originally entered. On a third, I saw a version of the quiet wing with patients moving calmly under bright lights, more occupied than it had been in years. The screen in the center showed me from behind, standing exactly where I was then. That was the moment everything aligned in the worst possible way. Lena had not been saying hallways physically moved like walls on wheels. She had been describing a wing that preserved multiple operational states and shifted which one remained authoritative after midnight. The cameras, maps, badge logs, and staff assignments were not all wrong. They belonged to different versions of the same institutional space, and the building's security systems were trying to authenticate more than one at once. Something touched my shoulder. I spun and found the other version of me, standing close enough that I could smell cold coffee on his uniform. He looked exhausted, not monstrous, not distorted, just older by several sleepless nights, maybe several years. His badge bore my name and an issue date 4 years earlier than mine. "You need to go back before morning count," he said. "Once they census you on this side, both desks keep you." I asked what this side meant. I asked whether he was real. I asked whether I was. He answered only the practical question. He pointed down the hall toward a fire door with a yellow closure notice taped across it. "When you open that, do not look at the map." I wish I could say I refused to obey something wearing my face. In truth, the relief of receiving a specific instruction overruled almost everything else. I went where he pointed. I opened the fire door. For an instant I saw both corridors at once, the sealed dusty one from my known wing and the brighter occupied one behind me. I did look at the map on the wall, because people always do the forbidden thing when it seems administrative rather than dangerous. The map listed me on the emergency response roster for both layouts. Then the overhead on my radio returned with a burst of static and the voice of the other officer asking where I was, because he had found my flashlight on the floor near the fire door and thought I might have fallen. I was kneeling in the sealed corridor of the real quiet wing with my left hand braced against the wall and my flashlight several feet away. The fire door stood closed and alarmed. My radio showed 2 missed calls. According to the badge log, I had not left the main desk area for the previous 11 minutes. Morning administration treated it as a stress event complicated by fatigue. Maintenance swore the old maps were consistent with renovation records, though when I asked to see them later, the file set had changed. Lena was transferred after Thanksgiving and told the day nurse that the right desk had finally kept the wrong officer. Surveillance review found only one irregularity. A brief loop on West 12 in which my image appeared to enter the closed hall twice from 2 different angles. I still work security, though not that campus. I took a transfer after New Year's and told myself it was for promotion. But I still wake around 1:23 some nights, with the conviction that a corridor I have already walked is preparing to rearrange itself around a different version of my badge. And whenever I pass a wall map in any hospital, I check it twice, because I no longer believe buildings are as singular as the people they contain. Story 5. Last discharge order. He slid the competency review across the table to me and asked why I had changed my signature again. I had not signed the document. Not then. Not ever. The paper was older than my employment at the hospital by nearly a decade. The ink yellowed around the edges, the patient number written in a format the facility no longer used. Yet the narrative summary was in my style, down to the way I phrased insight as selectively intact under structured prompting. My own words were sitting in a forensic chart from years before I joined the staff. The patient watched me read it with mild disappointment, as if I had shown up late to a meeting we had already held too many times. I was a forensic psychiatrist in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, assigned to a secure state hospital that housed individuals found incompetent to stand trial, not guilty by reason of insanity, or otherwise too psychiatrically unstable for standard correctional placement. Forensic work differed from general psychiatry in ways the public rarely understood. The clinical tasks overlapped: medication management, risk assessment, mental status examination, treatment planning. But every note carried legal weight. Competency was not a feeling. Dangerousness was not a metaphor. We evaluated whether a person understood proceedings, could assist counsel, grasp plea consequences, appreciate roles in court, and maintain reality-based reasoning long enough for the justice system to proceed. Documentation had to be precise because it traveled beyond the chart into hearings, affidavits, and discharge decisions. Spring of 2026 had brought a backlog of court review deadlines, which meant more on-call overnight evaluations than anyone wanted. On the night in question, I had been called in just after 10 p.m. for a final discharge review on a long-term patient whose legal status needed confirmation before transport orders could be executed at dawn. The patient, Elias Voss, had been institutionalized for decades after a violent offense committed during a psychotic state in early adulthood. By the time I inherited the case, he was an old man on paper, though age sat strangely on him. He had outlasted prosecutors, treating psychiatrists, and 2 revisions of the hospital's electronic record system. The secure hospital sat outside Baton Rouge in a low complex of brick and reinforced glass connected by locked sally ports and interior corridors that always smelled faintly of disinfectant, copier toner, and Louisiana humidity trapped by too much air conditioning. Overnight evaluations were conducted in Interview Suite C near the forensic administration wing. The room held a bolted table, 2 chairs, 1 camera dome, and a wall clock nobody trusted because it gained 4 minutes every month. I arrived in business clothes under a white coat because I had expected only chart review and a short interview. The night attending on the unit handed me the packet with visible relief. Elias had been clinically stable for months, compliant with treatment. No recent violence, no overt psychosis, oriented, cooperative, and repeatedly cleared by the treatment team for conditional transfer to a step-down. Forensic residence. My task was to conduct the final competency and risk-focused evaluations supporting the discharge order. Routine. Important, but routine. I reviewed the active chart first. Long admission history. Multiple medication trials. Cognitive testing consistent with chronic illness but adequate current functioning. Years of progressively calmer notes. Then I moved to the legal archive, because forensic habits become ritual over time. Always check prior court summaries. Always confirm wording across eras. Always read the oldest report if the patient has been housed long enough to gather myth. The earliest scanned admission materials were incomplete, but the continuity reports from later years were extensive. At 11 p.m., I opened a competency review dated 12 years before my employment at the hospital and found my own language inside it. Not generic overlap, not the same clinical vocabulary everyone shares, my language. The particular way I paired goal-directed with guardedly cooperative. The same 3-part sentence structure I used when differentiating factual recall from legal appreciation. Then I saw the signature block. Daniel Arlen, Doctor of Medicine. My name, my stomach tightened in a way clinical anxiety almost never allowed. I checked the metadata expecting a scan overlay error or a mistaken author merge from the record conversion. The author field listed me. Staff credential number matched my current one except with 2 extra leading digits used in older systems. The document creation date preceded my medical school graduation by years. I told myself someone had borrowed text from a later template during migration. That explanation held for perhaps 30 seconds. Then I opened a second report from 9 years before my hire and found the same thing. A brief risk addendum authored by me, same signature variant, same stylistic habits, same reference to jurisprudence standards I actually cited in residency. The patient was brought to interview Suite C at 11:30 p.m. in soft restraints that were removed once he was seated, per protocol for cooperative long-term forensic residents. Elias Voss was in his late 60s by the chart, though he moved with a measured economy that made age hard to place. He had white hair, steady eyes, and the composure of someone for whom institutions had long ago ceased to be temporary. I introduced myself. He smiled faintly. "Tonight you are using the short version of your name." I asked what he meant. He nodded toward the packet. "Sometimes you sign Daniel Arlen. Sometimes just D. Arlen. Once you used the middle initial and crossed it out." I did not respond. "In forensic interviewing, you do not reward tangentiality too early." I proceeded with the structured questions. Name, date, location, purpose of interview, understanding of legal status, awareness of proposed discharge, he answered clearly. Oriented to person, place, season, approximate date. Knew he was being considered for step-down placement. Understood conditional supervision terms. Described the original offense as something committed during psychosis for which he remained morally and legally accountable. He was, in every observable sense, competent for the conversation. Then I asked whether he had any questions for me before I completed the report. "Yes," he said. "Why do you keep pretending this is the last one?" My first clinical formulation was obvious. Institutionalized patients often developed repetitive beliefs around hearings, discharge promises, and staff roles. Repetition protected them from disappointment. I documented the statement mentally as possible perseveration. I asked him to explain. He folded his hands and looked not at me but at the legal archive packet. "You come in overnight because you don't want the team around when you realize the wording has changed again. You review the old reports. You notice your name then. You ask me the same competency questions in a slightly different order, hoping the structure will make the rest feel impossible instead of familiar. That was too specific for comfort and still not enough to prove anything beyond a long-term patient's intense observation of staff routines. Forensic patients learned us. They watched who used forms and who trusted memory, who paraphrased, who quoted, who left space before signatures. But he should not have known about the archive documents unless staff had discussed them in his presence, which they had not. I shifted to collateral verification. Asked nursing to confirm whether Elias had ever referenced me before this night. They said no. Asked medical records whether any migration errors had affected archived author fields. Overnight records staff could not fully investigate but saw no global issue. Asked the unit attending whether any prior evaluators had names resembling mine. None. When I returned to the interview room, Elias had arranged the old reports into a precise stack, oldest to newest. "You skip the one from 2018 every time," he said. "It bothers you the most." I looked despite myself. The 2018 report contained a discharge recommendation deferred for identity continuity, concerns insufficiently understood within current diagnostic framework. The phrase read like my language under pressure, the kind of wording I used when I believed something significant and could not reduce it to a recognized diagnosis. The signature was mine again. In 2018, I was a fellow in another state. I copied the reports and began a side-by-side comparison with my current notes. Same syntax habits, same uncommon phrasing. Even the way I corrected myself with dashes in dictated text seemed preserved after transcription. People underestimate how individual their clinical writing becomes. Reading those reports felt less like encountering forgery than like discovering journals you had once written during a forgotten illness. Small discrepancies began surfacing beyond the reports. My staff profile in the hospital directory listed a committee assignment from 2022 that I had never served on. An archived roster from the Forensic Education Conference included my name among presenters 2 years before employment. Credentialing records showed a temporary privileges renewal, signed during a month when I was verifiably working elsewhere. None of it arrived all at once. Each item emerged only when I looked for stabilizing evidence. Every attempt to prove the archive wrong expanded the archive instead. I called the overnight medical director and gave him a carefully limited account. Author metadata discrepancies, possible identity contamination in legacy records, need to pause discharge review pending verification. He told me to finish the clinical interview and flag the legal packet for morning administration. Sensible advice. Hospitals survive by forcing impossible things back into workflow. So I resumed the interview. Elias answered risk questions appropriately. No current hallucinations, no violent ideation, no intent to abscond. Full awareness of residence rules and medication requirements then. Without prompting, he said, "The problem is not whether I can be discharged. The problem is that one of us already was." I asked whether he was speaking metaphorically. "No," he said. "I mean the records cannot hold both trajectories cleanly anymore." He spoke with the calm of a man discussing weather damage to a roof. He said that over years of evaluations, the distinction between examiner and examinee had eroded in the file whenever the institution tried to create a coherent, long narrative for his case. Long stays demanded continuity. Continuity demanded a stable observer. The system had kept selecting me because my style fit the reports already. There then gradually selected earlier and earlier versions to support itself. According to him, that process had not only inserted me backward into his documentation, it had been replacing forward parts of my own professional history to balance the exchange. That was delusional. It was also close enough to the record anomalies in front of me that I could not dismiss it with clinical ease. I ended the interview temporarily and went to my office. I wanted external anchors, medical school transcripts, residency files, license records, my home address history. My laptop, connected through the hospital network, loaded my state licensure page normally. Then an older hospital newsletter surfaced in a search result from the forensic facility itself, congratulating me on 10 years of service. I opened it and found my photograph from last year clipped beside a quote I had never given. At 12:40 a.m., the active chart for Elias Voss refreshed. A new addendum appeared under my name, timestamped 12:58 a.m. Patient continued to externalize authorship confusion, but demonstrated consistent recognition of evaluator across repeated discharge contexts. Repeated discharge contexts. I had not written it, yet the sentence contained a clinical restraint I recognized as mine. The refusal to state what frightened me directly while preserving it in neutral terminology. I printed the addendum and took it back into interview suite. C. Elias looked tired in a way he had not earlier, as if my resistance had exhausted him. "You print them now," he said. "That means you're farther along." I asked him one question then, not as a psychiatrist, but as a man trying to locate himself. Which one of us is the patient? He thought for several seconds. The chart stopped answering that reliably a long time ago. That was the climactic moment, though it did not feel climactic. It felt administrative, like opening the wrong drawer and finding every file mislaid in the same direction. I reviewed his original commitment narrative again. Certain biographical details aligned disturbingly with mine if you changed dates and institutions. A father in law enforcement. Early academic acceleration. Periods of insomnia during training. None definitive. Just enough resonance that once seen, the parallels seemed less like coincidence and more like gradual replacement. His old therapy summaries described ambitions and fears uncomfortably close to things I had once said in supervision. My own personnel file now contained a scanned orientation checklist for a secure unit I had supposedly joined years earlier. By 1:30 a.m., I could no longer identify a stable edge where my documented history ended and the hospital's version began. Morning transport could not wait forever, and forensic systems dislike uncertainty more than they dislike error. I had to either complete the discharge review or formally halt it. I sat in interview suite C with the final form in front of me, the one authorizing conditional release to the step-down residents. Elias watched me without pressure. "Do you want to leave?" I asked him. He gave the only honest answer I heard all night. "I want one of us to." I signed the order. Even now I cannot explain why. Clinical evidence supported discharge. Administrative pressure supported discharge. But there was another reason below both. I wanted to see which history the institution would keep once a final decision forced it to choose. Transport took him at dawn. The record shows I completed the evaluation at 2:10 a.m., noted no acute psychosis, and recommended discharge with continuity of care. The record also shows in archived crosslinks that should not exist that I conducted similar reviews in 2014, 2018, and 2021. In one version, I deferred release. In another, I approved it. In a third, the signature is partially illegible, as if the author's hand had changed mid-name. By noon, the hospital directory listed me not as attending psychiatrist but as resident physician, despite the access level on my badge remaining unchanged. My secretary asked whether I was feeling better after my return from leave, a leave I had never taken. The legal office emailed asking for clarification on a report I supposedly authored 8 years earlier. At home that evening, my framed residency certificate looked subtly wrong. Same institution, different year. I still practice forensic psychiatry. I still conduct competency evaluations, risk assessments, and discharge reviews with the same calm voice and the same careful language. But I keep copies of my credentials in 3 places now. And every time I sign a report, I compare the shape of my name against the last one to make sure it has not drifted. Sometimes, when a patient studies me too long and smiles with recognition I do not deserve, I wonder whether Elias Voss was discharged into the world at all, or whether the hospital simply needed one of us outside the locked unit so the file could continue from both directions at once.